Let's take a look at the Canon 80D, specifically for video, what I like about it, what I don't like. Let's start with inside the camera, the improvements that we can't see. So the sensor itself has gone from 20.2 megapixels on the 70D to 24.2 megapixels on the 80D. I'm not usually a big fan of increasing the pixel density because I am actually using it for video, and less pixels, like the Sony a7S, gather more light because they're larger. So this one does make the image sharper, it looks great, and it seems like Canon's been able to do that without sacrificing low light performance. And part of that is the new Digic 6 processor, up from the 5 Plus in the 70D, and that is helping with the sensor to make everything, even the expandable ISO is another feature up to 25,600. All those things together are producing nice results inside the camera, even in low light situations. All these features actually exist in the T6i, which actually came out before the 80D. However, the 80D has a better autofocus system. Its dual CMOS AF is better than the hybrid system in the T6i. We also get more focus points, going from 19 on the 70D to 45, which again is going to help us with that continuous autofocus in video mode. They've also improved the auto white balance features of this camera, basically helping with color cast. But what's cool is every white balance option, there are a whole bunch of them, including full manual, they all have white balance shift. So if you're in a really tough lighting situation, you can almost shift out of any bad color situation with the 80D. They've also put in MP4 format along with the MOV. So if you want to be really quick and deliver to the web right out of the camera, you can use MP4. If you're going to do more extensive post-processing on your video, then you can shoot in MOV for the max dynamic range. A big one for me when it comes to video is they upgraded the 60 frames a second to 1080p. So you no longer have to drop down to 720p to get 60 frames a second. You can choose to do 1080p, give you your slow motion at the same resolution. You don't have to make that compromise. They've built a time-lapse option into this camera, so that's really nice if you want to fire off a time-lapse. Also, the 70D had Wi-Fi, so does the 80D, but they added NFC capabilities. If you have a compatible smartphone, you can touch it and transfer to your phone easily. And they've increased the max ISO to 25,600, which should help with low light performance at ISOs that are lower than that maximum range. Let's take a look at what's new on the camera itself, those things we can access and actually see and touch on the 80D, starting with the much heralded headphone jack. They've now added a headphone jack for people shooting video. This can be really nice because you can monitor the audio while you're recording, before you're recording, whenever you need to, if you're recording audio into the camera. Going along with that, some of those inputs like mic and headphones have actually been shifted forward so that when you open the tilt screen and it's facing you, you can actually spin it around without hitting those cables. So that's pretty nice. They've upgraded the battery just a tiny bit. It's basically the same LPN6, except this is an LPN6N, so you can use your old batteries, but the newer one is going to actually give you a little bit more life. The onboard microphone on the 70D was on top. Now it's in front. Not a big deal. You're not really going to be using that more than reference audio anyways. It's better off if you record with a microphone either attached to the camera that's going in or audio separately like I'm doing now. In fact, having the microphones on the front may actually pick up more autofocus noise, which could be bad if you're recording your audio on the camera itself. So let me talk about the additions to the 80D that I really like. Again, 1080p, 60 frames a second. You can shoot sports at full 1080 now to mix in with your other 1080 if you need to. You can shoot slow motion and not have to downgrade to 720p, as I mentioned, so you don't have to compromise that 1080p image. The touchscreen is not new, but it's very critical to video shooting. It has become very critical to my video shooting, and it's hard for me to go back to the 60D and not have a touchscreen because it's so easy to access all the functions. And when you have a good continuous autofocus the way you do on the 70D and this 80D, you can tap and do a rack focus. You can tap to focus, just like you're used to on a smartphone. Here you can actually tap and hold and move around the screen with the subject and keep it in focus. So the touch screen is very handy on this, and in fact, something that you don't get in some of the other cameras that may be considered better, such as some of the Sonys at the same price level. But the touchscreen to me has become pretty invaluable. The manual audio controls, I do record into the camera a lot of times. I will do wireless mics right into these cameras, and the preamp is good enough if you have a good wireless mic. But now you can change the level of those manual audio levels while you're recording. Before, you'd have to stop and set it. Now, the headphone and the microphone, you can both adjust those while you're recording. And again, not needing an intervalometer, an extra piece of gear to shoot a time lapse. If I want to shoot one, it's built in the camera. I'm more likely to use it when I don't have to add on additional gear. Now I can just have my very thin remote that I use for starting, stopping, and focusing, and I'm off and running. That great continuous autofocus that you get, you can now control the speed of that. Before on the 70D, it was one speed, and when it would shift from something that wasn't in focus to something that was in focus, if you didn't like that speed, you were stuck with it. Now you can actually choose if you want to make that faster transition between focus points or a slower, nice focus pull. Even the noise from the 60D compared to the 80D, the noise in the 80D seems to be like a softer, almost more like a grain, like a film grain. So even the noise when you get up in those higher ISO looks better to me. And the Wi-Fi and the NFC are great. Not something I thought I would need when I was testing out the 70D. I didn't really use it. This time I got it set up on the 80D. It was really nice for easily transferring some small clips to my phone and then sharing them socially. Which reminds me, I share a lot of clips while I'm testing in between reviews, so check those out. And one cool thing that I noticed, when you tilt the 180-degree screen at you and you just tilt it just a little bit, it actually orients you either on the left side or the right side. So it changes based on how you prefer to see yourself on the screen. So that was something that may have existed before, but I never saw it. Just a little tilt and it oriented different. I think that's a feature. It was cool. Okay, so what are the things that I don't particularly care for with the 80D? The one you'll hear the most is that at its price range, it doesn't have 4K. Some other cameras like the Sony a6300 do have 4K, so that's just decision if it matters that much to you. It doesn't matter to me that much yet. I would like to have it. However, in the Sony a6300, we do get a great continuous autofocus like the 80D, but you don't get a swivel screen, which is very important when you're shooting by yourself, and we don't get a touch screen. So those features have become more critical to the way I shoot right now, at least, than 4K. So it's a compromise. You have to decide what you want for yourself. When it comes to exposure and focus options, the 80D lacks those. We don't have zebra stripes, so we can see when things are overexposed. You do have highlight alerts, but on my 60D, I can snap a picture while I'm filming video, and immediately it'll show up on the screen, and it'll blink if it's overexposed. That was a real quick way for me to use highlight alert. Well, now you can't snap a photo on the 80D, and you have to shoot a little piece of video and then stop, go into the preview, and then the highlight alert will work. So it's there, but it's not really functional the way you'd want it in a fast-moving environment. Also, no focus peaking. And on top of no focus peaking, which are the lines around something that's in focus, you don't get that. You also can't magnify the image to punch into the image, like I've shown on this channel before, to get critical focus while you're recording. So it'd be fantastic, like the Sony a7S and other cameras, if you could magnify in real time to be able to check that focus. We don't get that. Also, there's a couple features you don't get unless you're in the one particular single point autofocus mode. Most of the time I'm in face tracking, and the digital level won't display, as well as the AF servo speed that I talked about and the AF track sensitivity. So that autofocus speed change. You don't get that unless you're in the Flexi Zone single autofocus mode. And the 1080p 60 frames, while I love it, it's not available in the format that I would usually shoot, the .mov. It's only available in MP4. So The good thing is the MP4 looks really good. I haven't noticed a whole lot of difference, but it would be really nice if I could keep my format consistent and get max dynamic range on that 1080p 60 frames. You don't get that, only in MP4. And there's no native flat picture profile. You can tweak all the picture profiles, which is really nice. And I have my own that I use to make things a little flatter. You can check the description. I'll put my own picture profile recipe in there. But we don't get Canon log. You know, on the Sonys, they have XAVCS codec, which is an advanced pro codec, as well as you get a flavor of S-Log, which is really nice. Those are professional features that give you a really flat image that you can really work with in post-production. We don't get any of that from Canon on the 80D. And if you're using the HDMI out to go to a recorder, external recorder, or even trying to live stream with the camera, it's not a clean HDMI. So at a minimum, you're going to have the focus box on the screen, so it doesn't really work for recording or live streaming. What I did like is that the HDMI, unlike my 60D, displayed full res on my iCan monitor. The 60D down-resed, and it was almost useless for focusing. The 80D at least gives me my full res HDMI into my monitor. Also, you get an extra custom profile setting on the dial, so if you have different situations that you'll be filming in, you want to click into another one really fast, then you have more options for setting that on the camera and getting to it really quick. So a couple other features for video, including some creative modes like black and white and all these things you can bake into the image, something I wouldn't do. They're in there for video. They're supposed to be in HDR mode, which I never found. So if you found how to get to HDR mode, let me know in the comments, please. But overall, I like this camera. It works really well at what it does. Continuous autofocus. The image looks fantastic. And it would be hard to go wrong if you invested in this camera. I built a whole channel almost on a 60D. So you could go for years with just this camera and adding different pieces of glass. All right, that's my experience with my loaner Canon 80D. It has to go back to the shop, unfortunately, but I really like this camera. Make sure to subscribe for follow-ups and more tutorials and reviews just like this one. Also, I do a lot of behind-the-scenes gear stuff in between these videos. So Podcast Helper, Snapchat, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and ask your questions in the comments, and I'll see you next time. So would I buy the 80D? It's a $300 difference between this and the 70D, and the 70D price is gonna keep falling. So if it was an upgrade from the 70D, if I already had that, probably not, unless you really wanted that 1080p 60 frames. If it was my first DSLR, this is the best DSLR, in my opinion, for video in the crop sensor range. Canon has perfected this since the T2i, and it does what it does really well. I love having it in my studio, even the bigger size, whereas the Sony a6300 or a smaller mirrorless camera is great to carry around with you all the time. I do like working with the bigger camera in studio, just depends on what kind of shooting you're doing. So I would have a hard time not getting the 80D if it was brand new, but if budget is the deciding factor, you can get a 70D at a much better price and be just as happy. And that's the second time we've done that. Let's hope we got the audio this time.